Christians hear a lot about radical Islam now, and there's great fear, especially in Europe, also in the United States, about the persecution of Christians by Muslims. In fact, the rate of martyrdom is something like 100,000 a year now. Now, the interesting thing is that 500 years ago, that same fear gripped Europe. We look at the Reformation and people are reading about it and they think, well, the only thing that anyone was thinking about was whether we were going to have sola scriptura or justification by faith, or whether the Pope was going to win, as if the entire context of the Reformation was really entirely theological. But at the time of the Reformation, or we say leading up to it, one of the biggest things on people's mind was Islam, because Islam had just 50 years prior to Luther conquered Constantinople and was in a kind of a scissors movement in Europe, really threatening to conquer Europe. And this had been going on since the origin of Islam, this attack on Christians and the attempt to either subordinate them or eliminate them. So that isn't anything new. We're feeling the same fear today as it did then. Well, what effect did it have on the Reformation? That's interesting. One effect it had was it made it worse in the following sense, that Luther and later Calvin and other reformers believed that the threat of Islam was actually the scourge of God. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church was so bad that God was using the Muslims as a mode of purification, a rod of anger. And so they thought that they were living in the very last time. Now we're celebrating or remembering the Reformation 500 years later, but that would astound Luther, because he didn't think there was going to be anything 500 years later. He thought he was in the end times, and that made him read his time as if it was a literal playing out of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. And that's the reason that he was characterizing the Pope as the whore of Babylon. He literally was the coming about for Luther of what would bring the world to an end. And so there wasn't a real concern among Luther and Lutherans for what would have happened 100 years from now, 200 years, 300 years in what we were doing, because they thought they would witness the coming of Christ. And of course, if you think that, you're not worried as much about what might be the long-term consequences of what you do and what kind of language you use in your push for reform. And that's one of the things that made the Reformation turn out as more of a great splintering event rather than simply a reform within the church.